Good morning. Before I get into the message, I thought maybe I'd bring up just a couple of things for a minute or two here, just to kind of remind us of what's going on around us. And it's funny because I was thinking these aren't related to the message, but in some ways they are. Because today's message is about the resurrection. And the resurrection is talking about what's going to happen in the end times when God raises all believers up. And I think we're on a path that we're getting closer and closer to the end times as time goes on. Not to say this is the reason, but if you look at the trajectory we're going on, I don't know if you realize this or not, but for the second time in 1 week, a governmental entity has said a business is not allowed to operate in our territory because we disagree with your Christian beliefs. Not that they were discriminating, but their beliefs. If you haven't followed it this week, First San Antonio, Texas, awarded a contract for the airport and said, you may not have a Chick-fil-A in the airport. And they came out in the name of tolerance and banned Chick-fil-A from the airport. That's actually what they said. Well, San Antonio wasn't the only one to do this. Now Buffalo, New York has done the same thing in 1 week. And the reason I bring this up is because if you look worldwide, Chick-fil-A is only an example here, but if you look worldwide, what I'm seeing over and over again is governments worldwide are not only banning Christian actions, but banning Christian thought. Because if you look at Chick-fil-A, Chick-fil-A has no history whatsoever of discrimination against anybody as an employee or a customer. Yet because they made contributions to groups that governments disagreed with, suddenly they're being banned. This isn't the first time. Remember, New York City did it, San Francisco did it, a number of other places. But again, look at the trajectory we're on, and what's even more scary is the fact that if you've traveled the world much, you'll know the United States is in far better position than any other country in the world in this area. Canada's worse than the U.S. is, Europe is worse than Canada is, and if you start going to the Middle East or China or someplace like that, you're going to find out you can forget about talking about Christianity without being in big trouble. The other thing I've seen this week is not only are Christian beliefs being shut down by governmental entities, but in addition to that, the media is completely ignoring what's happening around the world. Remember, again, I talked last week about how you had the massacre in, New Zealand in the mosque. Well, did you hear about the 4 churches in Nigeria that were burned to the ground this week? Or the 30 or 40 Christians that were murdered because they said they were Christians this week in Nigeria? No. It's happening every single week. And the media doesn't even bother covering it because it wasn't some protected group. And what I'm seeing is, again, not that any one of these things means it's the end times, but there is a seriousness to our message that just gets more and more serious every day as we get closer and closer to the end. Now, I don't know if the end is in 12 minutes, 12 years, or 1,200 years. But we're getting closer every day. Now let's get into the text here in 1 Corinthians 15. It's funny, this week, as I talk about the global issues, there's also been a local thing that's been happening with my company. Caleb is going around and installing some new wireless networks. And these things are beautiful. He's gone over to some of the country clubs we take care of. And we're replacing 10-year-old technology. And basically, instead of being able to, each access point, instead of being able to handle, 5 or 10 users, they can handle 500 users per access point. Instead of being able to communicate at slow speeds, these can actually operate at gigabit internet speeds. And not only that, they now have gigabit connections to the internet, and we're just talking about just flying on this. Now, why do I bring this up? Because whether we're talking about the physical network or the wireless network or whatever else, the network is the basis of all the computer operations that happen in a company. And not just computer operations. HR uses it to track what's happening with employees. The timekeepers use it to track what's happening for paychecks. Accounting uses it. Doesn't matter what division you've got, every division uses it. The people in the restaurants of the country clubs use it in order to set up the menus every night. The network is the basis of it. And let me say this, I don't care how good your software is or your computer is or anything else, if your network is not functioning, it really doesn't matter. You're not getting anywhere. The network is the center and the core and the basis of everything that we work with. You know something? The reason we're spending so much time in 1 Corinthians 15 and Paul put so much time into it is because the resurrection is the basis of everything that we do as a believer. The resurrection is the proof that Jesus Christ beat death. Just like the network is the core, the basis of everything we do in our business, the resurrection is the core and the basis of everything that we see and do as a believer. And often we forget about that, and we forget about the importance of the resurrection. We may not say that, but our actions don't reflect our beliefs in a lot of cases. And if we concentrate on the resurrection, it will help us to maintain a holy life and to strengthen the relationship that we have with God. Now let's actually look at 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 33 and 34. Start with 33. Do not be deceived. Bad company corrupts good morals. Well, the first thing we've got to see is, what is the context of this? The context is verse 32, where he said, If from human motives I fought with wild beasts at Ephesus, what does it profit me? If the dead are not raised, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. So Paul was talking about this absurd statement of, what if the dead are not raised? Well, we may as well just party, because if we're not being raised anyway, it's all earth and doesn't make any difference. Well, in response to that, he's now saying, don't be deceived. Bad company corrupts good morals. What he's saying is, if we hang out with people that are saying these kind of things, if we start to believe what they believe, we're going to forget about the importance of the resurrection. And let me say something else. This saying that he's saying here, this is not a Christian saying. Paul is quoting a saying that shows up in non-Christian literature before him. And the reason I bring that up is because even unbelievers recognize bad company can corrupt good morals. Now remember, this is a proverb, so it means it's generally true. It doesn't mean in every circumstance. It doesn't mean if you walk out and talk to a thief, suddenly 3 seconds later you're going to be stealing something, okay? But it does mean, if you think about it, and it makes sense, if you're constantly just hanging out with people and associating with people and going along with the way they live and act, and the people are problematic people in how they live, it's going to start affecting you. If you start hanging out with people that are constantly using language you don't want to be using, it's going to seem natural to start using that language. By contrast, also, I find that good people can promote godliness and morality as well. I know that when I was in college age, I went to a Bible study every Friday night. And it's funny, they said, you'll never get college students to hang out at a Bible study on Friday nights. Well, we ended up getting about 30 kids there, 30 of us there every single Friday. And what I found is that Bible study drew me closer to God, and we did stuff. We studied the Bible for an hour and a half. Then we'd either go bowling or we'd go whatever, we'd have a party or whatever. It wasn't just Bible study, but the point is, it strengthened us. It drew us closer to God. Who we associate with and what we do makes a difference in our lives. And all Paul is saying here is, look around you, it's going to make a difference. Now look at verse 34. Verse 34 says, become sober-minded as you ought, and stop sinning. For some have no knowledge of God. I speak this to your shame. A number of little things in here. The first thing it says is, be sober-minded. Literally this means, if you look at the original, it says, sober up righteously. This sober up is talking to something you'd say to someone who is drunk and coming out of a drunken stupor. That's the language that would have been used back then. And what he's saying is, think clearly about your living and about your righteousness in righteous living. Now, one of the things that we frequently get mixed up here is we hear that, and I've often heard this verse used for about be sober, meaning be stern, no humor. You can't smile, you can't crack a smile if you're a Christian. We all know that. Because we never smile, and we never laugh, and we never tell jokes, right? No. But that verse is frequently used that way. I don't care if you're telling jokes or you're studying or you're talking or whatever, all of that can be done to honor God. I think God has a sense of humor, and it's fine to go ahead and tell jokes. Matter of fact, in our house, sometimes we'll go 4 or 5 minutes without telling a joke or a pun, but it happens. But the point is that we're constantly joking around. There's nothing wrong with that. That's not what this sobriety is talking about. This sobriety here is talking about looking at your life and making sure you're living a righteous, holy life for God. Now, if we continue in verse 34, though, it also says in almost all the versions, stop sinning. Now, that's not actually what it says in the original. The only version of the Bible in this case that got it right that I found so far is actually the King James, which literally says, sin not. It's an imperative, and it's saying sin not. Now the reason, it's not bad, why the other versions put stop sinning in there is because this was being addressed to the Corinthians, and the Corinthians were sinning. And they were sinning specifically in what they were doing and saying here. But even if you're not sinning, it means don't sin. It's an imperative. Now in Corinth, part of this sinning was they were denying the resurrection. And they weren't living like Christ. The resurrection was not a reality in their life. Oh, sure, they could tell you, yeah, Jesus rose, sure. You're going to rise, sure. But it didn't mean anything to them. It wasn't real. One of the things I remember when I was a kid is that when I was about 6 or 7 years old, I was constantly falling down the back steps of my house. That comes as a big surprise to people like Linda that know me that I would fall down. But the point is that I was constantly falling down. It got to the point where my mother was so mad at my dad for it. He said, "You've got to rip out those stairs." So we had a porch that was maybe about this tall and went down to the ground. And you got to put a porch out there so that the kid can come out without falling down the stairs. Well, she got so mad that he finally said, he got around to it. He called my uncle over, and the two of them built a new porch. Well, two things happened. Number one, I knew they were building the porch, but it wasn't reality to me. Because even though I knew they were building the porch, I still remember it, and so do they, coming in the front door of the house at full speed, hitting the door like this, running through the living room on a dead run and saying, "Hi, Dad, bye, Dad, hi, Uncle Dick, bye, Uncle Dick," running out, straight out the back door, and all they said was it looked just like a Roadrunner cartoon with the coyote going off the cliff, because the stairs had been taken away. It was just a drop. And he said, they looked, and literally, my feet were still running. And for a moment there, I was in midair till I ended up splat down on the ground. The reality had not set in of the stairs being missing. That may sound trivial, but it's just like the reality of the resurrection had not set in on the Corinthians. And by the way, if you have any questions and wonder, no, even after the new porch was put up and even after the new stairs were put up, I still fell down the stairs. It wasn't my dad and it wasn't the stairs, it was me. But there is a reality to situations, and you know something? It's one thing to say, I believe in the resurrection. It's another thing to live your life like you believe in the resurrection. There's a big difference. And that's what Paul's trying to get across to them here is your life showing that you believe in the resurrection? Or is your life showing that, no, you believe in the pagan deities and everything else because you're going along with all that stuff? What he's talking to the Corinthians. He wanted them to transform their lives so that it would show who they were. Now, in addition to that, this verse ends with something which is a condemnation. And it says, "For some have no knowledge of God. I speak this to your shame." You know, the Corinthians basically, first of all, let me clarify something. This is not talking to new believers. If you're a new believer and the only thing you know is that Jesus saved you, that's fine. But this is talking to people who have been believers for quite a while and simply didn't know God, didn't know anything about God. Yeah, they heard the basics, but they weren't growing, they weren't learning. And at least they had an excuse. They didn't have a Bible. They heard the scriptures read to them in church. But nobody there was no such thing as a Bible you carried to church. They would be scrolls, and they're so valuable, no one had personal scrolls. We have no excuse. We have no excuse whatsoever for not knowing God, knowing who He is, and knowing our relationship with Him. Because He's given it all to us. And what Paul's saying to the Corinthians is, this is to your shame if you don't know God. If you don't understand God. If you don't know the reality of God. I think we run the same danger. We need to know the reality of God in order to live a godly life. And we need to know about the resurrection because the resurrection is the basis of that reality. It's the proof of what Christ did. It's the proof that He paid for sin and beat death. If you want to avoid sin, I hear people all the time talking about, I want to live a holy life, I want to please God, I want to avoid sin. You want to avoid sin? Follow God. You want to avoid sin? Get to know God. You want to avoid sin? Strengthen your relationship with God. That's where it starts. It doesn't start with saying, no, I'm not going to do this. It starts with, yes, I'm going to do this. It starts with, yes, I'm going to love God, and I'm going to grow with God, and I'm going to learn about who God is and what He really says. People are constantly trying to find the will of God without looking about anything about God. And all they're really doing is looking for approval for their emotions. The will of God is in this book. It may not give you every detail of what you want to do, what you need to do, but the basics of it are there. And often we forget about that. Now, if we continue reading in verse 35, it says, "But someone will say, 'How are the dead raised, and with what kind of body do they come?'" Now, this is something which is a little hard to understand unless you know the background here. They're not actually talking about all the mechanisms of being raised here, and that's why Paul's going to go into the different types of bodies here. What they're really saying is, okay, do you mean that the bodies after they die are going to be reanimated? Kind of a Walking Dead type thing, okay? That's what they're actually asking. They're not asking about the mechanisms of resurrection yet. What they're saying is, okay, resurrection, you bury them, you plant them, and then, they get up and walk away. And Paul's saying, that's not the way it's working here. There's a spiritual body and a physical body. And he's so adamant about it, he starts verse 36 with, "You fool, that which you sow does not come to life unless it dies." And so here he's addressing specifically. I think this, when you see this, "you fool," you realize this isn't asking what's the order of resurrection or something like that. That's why he's talking about people that think that resurrection is just going to be get back up and walk away just the way you are. You know what the problem is with that? If I die and they put me in the grave, and a couple years later I get up and walk away, even if my body's back in the same condition it was, I still have a corruptible body. I still have a sin nature. I have all that kind of things that a glorified body doesn't have. Matter of fact, if you look, you know something? Christ was not the first person to be raised from the dead. What about Lazarus? What about Elijah, who raised a kid from the... Was it Elijah or Elisha? I think it was Elijah who raised a kid from the dead. You go back and find other resurrections. But here's the difference. Every one of those people that were resurrected died again because they did not have a glorified body. It was a temporary resurrection. The resurrection we're talking about here is not temporary. It's full, complete resurrection with a glorified body. And the point we're seeing here is, if you are resurrected in that body, nothing's happened, nothing changed. And not only that, it says, "That which you sow does not come to life unless it dies." Now that's common sense if you think about it. I mean, until you have a seed, you don't get a tree. I mean, has anybody ever gone out and planted, not transplanted a tree, but planted a tree in order to get a tree? No, you plant a seed. Same thing with a vegetable. You start with a tomato seed. Now again, like I said, we go out and we buy little tomatoes. That's not really growing it from seed. That's taking something that's already growing and moving it over, okay? When you grow things, you grow it from seeds. And to get seeds, something has to die. That's where seeds come from. But the point here is, the old plant does not rise from the dead. You don't plant a plant and then the plant comes up. It's just like bodies. You don't plant the bodies and then the bodies come back up. That's not the way it works. Instead, a new body comes up, a new spiritual body. Now, we'll talk about what that is a little bit in a few minutes, but it's a new spiritual body. If we look in verse 37, it says, "And that which you sow, you do not sow the body which is to be, but a bare grain, perhaps of wheat or something else." Really talking about what I've been talking about here. You don't plant all the wheat in the ground, you plant the seeds of the wheat. You don't plant the bodies. Well, we do plant the bodies, but they're not coming back the way they were. We're just planting to bury them and get them out of the way. Now, if we continue on to let me flip the pages back accidentally. If we continue on to verse 38, verse 38 says, But God gives it a body just as he wished, and to each of these seeds a body of its own. The thing I want you to look at here is in verse 38 is God has a plan. It's not random that a tomato seed grows into a tomato. It's not random that a earthly person, when they die, is raised in a spiritual body when we're resurrected. None of that is at random. And not only that, we are resurrected as who we were. It's not like we're just, let's just give him something brand new that doesn't look anything like him. When Christ came back from the dead, people knew who he was, even though it was a glorified body. The point being is, God has planned all this out. Each seed is unique, each species is unique, and each person is unique. If we go to verse 39, it says, All flesh is not the same flesh, but there is one flesh of men, and another flesh of beasts, and another of flesh of birds, and another of fish. So again, what we're seeing here is, There's a difference. Now, why is Paul even taking the time to say this? Because if you think about it, if I came to you and said, birds are different than fish, and fish are different than animals in the field, and animals in the field are different than humans, you'd probably look and go, yeah, right, duh, like we didn't know that one. Because that's what Paul's saying here. So why is he saying this? Because Paul's not stupid, okay? The reason he's saying that is he's explaining to them and setting up how the spiritual body is different from the physical body. Because you know something? We can look out in the field and we can see a cow and we can go, that's not a bird. Hopefully you can see that. Linda has, I don't know if you've ever seen it on Facebook, Linda has beautiful photographs she posts all the time of our backyard. And there's the pond back there and there's birds and everything else. But you know something? Never once did I see one of the shots of her having the eagle close up, because an eagle goes back there, and say, oh, look at a cow. I know the difference between an eagle and a cow. I'm not bragging here, but I do know the difference, okay? The point I'm trying to make is people don't have the same frame of reference for a physical body and a glorified body. It's not like we can look all around us and go, oh yeah, he's got a glorified body, he's got a physical body. No, it's not. So Paul's trying to set up, it is as different as these different species with your physical body and your glorified body. And that's why he's taking the time to explain this. It's not because he's stupid. And God has a plan for the different species. If you look at verse 40, it says there are also heavenly bodies. So Paul's now using an illustration. You can tell he preached. No, he says there are also heavenly bodies and earthly bodies, but the glory of the heavenly is one, and the glory of the earthly is another. Just like heavenly and earthly bodies are different, again, just like different species. One of the differences we see is an earthly body is corruptible. A heavenly body is not corruptible. Earthly bodies, we can get sick, we can die. Heavenly bodies don't. Resurrected bodies don't. If we go on to verse 41, it says, there is one glory of the sun, and another glory of the moon, and another glory of the stars. For star differs from star in glory. So now he's comparing it to the universe that we can see. And it should be pretty obvious. The sun, the moon, the stars are all different. Each one is amazing, but they're different. For any of us who are old enough to remember, do you remember where you were on July 20th, 1969? I do. I was at my grandfather's house, sitting in front of the old television. It was a big day. It was my dad's 32nd birthday. Now you guys may not have known that, because there's something else that also happened that day. That day was the day that Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon. And if you remember it, it was called a moon landing. It wasn't called a sun landing. And the reason is because before he even got a chance to step out, if he had tried to go to the sun, he would have been incinerated. Now that may sound simple to you, but you know something? There is a difference between the moon, the sun, and the stars. And Paul's pointing that out here. They're not the same. Just like these different species that have been created, these different bodies that have been created. The sun is not the moon is not the sun. You obviously can't interchange them. And not only that, but if you look at stars, each star is unique. It's funny, if you have a telescope and you look at them, you're not going to see everything. But even looking through a telescope, we've done that, and you can really see the differences between different stars. And obviously, as you get closer, you'd see even more. So again, Paul's pointing out that these differences aren't just about the physical and spiritual body. They carry out all through nature. They carry out through heavenly bodies. They carry out through species. And this is just, it's obvious, and we should know this. It's all part of God's plan. If you look at verse 42 says, so also is the resurrection of the dead. So there he brings it back, the comparison. It is sown a perishable body, it is raised an imperishable body. Now we talked about that already, but the perishable body is a body that can die, a body that can suffer corruption. A natural body dies. Once we're raised, we will never corrupt. We're not going to get sick anymore. We're not going to die. If we look at verse 43, he continues on. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it's raised in power. Now the dishonor and the honor, I wouldn't be 100% sure of what this is saying, but what I actually believe this is saying here is we are sown with a sin nature. The moment we're conceived, the moment we're born, we have a sin nature in our physical body. So that's the dishonor. The honor is that we're going to be raised without a sin nature. We are going to be truly able to have a complete relationship and fellowship with God with no sin standing between us forever. We won't even have the temptation to sin at that point in time. It just won't be part of our nature. And when he talks about weakness and power, I think again what he may be talking about here is when you're born physical, you can get sick, you can die, you can have all kinds of things happen to you. When you're resurrected, no more sickness. I woke up with a headache this morning. I'm not going to wake up with a headache when I got a resurrected body. You know, how many mornings, and again, as you get older, you start to know, how many mornings do you wake up and you just ache and hurt and your shoulder hurts and all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, I remember that football injury and everything else. No more. Resurrected bodies aren't going to have that. It is going to be wonderful. In verse 44, it says, "It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. If there is a natural body, there is also a spiritual body." So what he's saying is, it's obvious you have the one and the other. If you believe in the resurrection, there has to be a spiritual body. But there's something else here that I think we have to clear up because it's misunderstood by a lot of people. Somehow the spiritual body is seen as unreal. Not quite, well, it's real, but it's not really, kind of maybe a little translucent or transparent or something, I don't know. But almost like a ghost or something like that. That's not what a spiritual body is at all. As a matter of fact, I'm not going to go into why here, but I actually believe that spiritual beings that we cannot see are actually more solid than we are. I think there's a biblical basis for that. But again, I'm not going into that right now. But the point being is, as far as these bodies go, we're not going to have some ethereal type body. We're not going to become angels. We're going to have a literal body. We're going to live in the New Jerusalem for eternity, and we're going to serve Jesus Christ, and we're going to work and learn and worship. So it's not an unreal body. And the other thing to remember here is that this spiritual body will actually be raised from the seed of the physical body that each one of us has. That's why Jesus was recognizable to people. Now, he wasn't instantly recognizable to everybody, but it was enough that you go, oh yeah, he's glorified, but yeah, it's him. So it's not like we're going to suddenly be, I'm going to die right now, and when I die, I'm going to come back as a different person. It's going to be like, oh, well, you're Gene now. No, I'm not Gene now or something like that. He's not me. I'm going to be able to recognize him. He's going to be able to recognize me. I don't doubt that. So I just want to clear up those myths because sometimes we think of these things, but they're not really in the Bible. Now if we go to verse 45, it says, "So also is it written, the first man, Adam, became a living soul. The last Adam became a living spirit." Now this is kind of confusing if you think about it. Because first Adam and last Adam, there were not two Adams as such. There were not two guys named Adam we're talking about here. The first Adam is Adam in the Bible. And he sinned and brought about corruption and brought about sin. The second Adam he's talking about here is representative of that, but it's not literally Adam. Sometimes the Mormons and people like that get that rather confused here and think that Adam became Christ. That's not what it means. But it means just as Adam brought about death, Christ brought about life. That's what it's talking about here. And there's a couple other things that we should see here. Is that if we look at what it says about the first Adam, Adam became a living soul. So when God breathed into him, he had life. But that's not what it says about the second Adam, which is Jesus Christ. It literally in the original says that he became a life-giving spirit. And if you think about it, yeah, Adam was alive, but Adam had no ability to transfer the resurrected life to anyone here. Jesus Christ does. If we go to verse 46, it says, "However, the spiritual is not first, but the natural, then the spiritual." Very simple what he's saying here. You're not born a spiritual body. You're born a natural body. You have that first, the natural body dies. When you're resurrected, you get a spiritual body. There's nothing really mysterious about this verse. Not only that, if you think about it, it makes sense for another reason. He's talking about Adam in the verse before. You don't need a glorified resurrected body if you've never sinned and have no sin nature because you'd already have a glorified resurrected body. Well, a glorified body you wouldn't even resurrect. We need a glorified resurrection because we are sinful and have inglorious bodies. Some of us a little more inglorious than others, but anyway, the point is we do not have a glorified body yet. Now if we look at verse 47, The first man is from the earth, earthy. The second man is from heaven. Well, again, pretty obvious. Adam was literally made from the dirt. Jesus came from heaven. He was incarnate. Now, something that I want to say here also that we need to take into account. We run into people who say they're believers, and I'm not going to judge that right at the moment, but we run into people who say they're believers, church leaders, etc., who also believe in biological evolution. Who say that no, Adam was a representation of something or other, but we really came from whatever, proto-being it was that we came from, okay? Well, in addition to the fact that we'd have no sin nature, which is a real problem, there's another thing that's a problem here. Because Paul is talking about Adam literally existing. If Adam didn't literally exist, then Paul's either ignorant or he's a liar. Now, I don't care which one of those two you have. If you have ignorance or lying under inspiration of the Holy Spirit, you got a problem. That would mean this book and whatever else Paul wrote would not be inspired and would not be part of the Bible. So before you start pitching Adam and Eve as literal, you better be prepared to pitch all the writings of Paul. And oh, by the way, Jesus also believed in the literal Adam. So you better be willing to pitch what Jesus said. Toss out the Gospels, toss out what Jesus did. You don't have much left once you've done that. So it's critical that we believe in a literal Adam and Eve that literally lived in the Garden of Eden. That's essential to our beliefs and something we can't give up on. Now, if we go back to verse 49, it says, "And just as we have borne the image of the earthy, we shall also bear the image of the heavenly." Again, fairly obvious. If we're born as a human, we have a similarity to Adam. We may look different, we may be tall, we may be short, we may be different colors, we may be different sizes, we may be whatever. We have male and female also. But when you look at people, you can go, aha, that's a human. You don't look at a cow and go, oh, that's a human. No, it's a cow. When we go home, we're going to meet Logan, who's our dog, and we're going to meet Penny, and we're going to meet Isaac, who are our cats. I have never once looked at Isaac and said, I wonder if you're human. No, it's obvious. He's a cat. Same with Logan. He's a dog. We're humans. Again, not saying anything really deep here, but the fact is we already as a human body and the physical body have a resemblance to Adam. Well, what he is saying, though, is in our resurrected body, we're going to have a similarity to Jesus Christ. Not that we're going to look identical to him, but it's going to be obvious that it's a glorified body just like he had. Now, we've gone through these verses. What are we going to get out of these verses? It's easy to just talk about the resurrection and forget about the meaning of it. Paul took, it wasn't divided by verses then, but took well over 50 verses, 58 verses, just to talk about the resurrection here. Because as we said, it's the basis of everything we believe in. And the resurrection is the basis for living a holy life. And if we go back to verses 33 and 34, we see that Paul was concerned about us not sinning. Not just with who we hang out with, but don't sin. It was an imperative. He's saying, watch your company, because you tend to act the same way. Watch who your friends are, because your language is liable to turn the same way. Watch your circumstances. When I was in high school, 10th grade, I worked at the Seabrook Tasty Freeze, if any of you guys remember that. Worked there for about 4 months. And one of the things that I credit myself with inventing was the upside-down banana split, where you took one of the giant cups and took 2 bananas, split them in half, and, all around 4 sides, and keep stacking the ice cream and stacking the hot fudge and stacking the strawberry, and you get like a massive banana split. And the other thing which I credit myself with inventing was forget about the double burgers and double things like that. I had the quad burger. 4 hamburgers and a bun. That was dinner, along with the upside-down banana split. What I also picked up was not only how to make quad burgers and upside-down banana splits, but I also picked up about 25 pounds in 4 months. It was, came off eventually, but it was not my finest hour, let's put it that way. And the reason I bring this up is because our circumstances affect us. If we keep putting our ourselves into circumstances that are not honoring to God, we're going to have trouble honoring God. If we keep hanging out with people that are not honoring God, it's going to make it more difficult for us to honor God. The entire point of bringing up there is a resurrection is to say, because of the reality of the resurrection, your life and my life has to change. If it's just an intellectual thought, who cares? I can teach a parrot an intellectual thought and have him say it back. Did it change its life? No. It needs to change us. And in addition to that, you also have to look at one of the biggest things we do is, where do we work? Do you work in an environment where they cheat people? Many, many years ago, I had a job for a couple of months and I realized they were not being fair to their customers. They were actually cheating their customers, telling them one thing and doing something else. When I found out, I left. Matter of fact, so did a lot of people in that company. But I left the company. I felt bad for people, for example, not so much anymore, but many years ago, if you remember it, you go to 7-Eleven, CVS, any of these stores, and there would just be all kinds of, the worst porn you can imagine just sitting right there for people to pick up. They started putting blockers in front of them, but here's the point. As a cashier, man, I felt sorry for those cashiers because it's like, you're working in a place and you got to ring that up? People have to make decisions on where they're going to work based on the environment of the work. There are some places that you may not be able to work. I'll say there are some places I know we cannot work. And that's something we have to take into account here. That has a big impact on our life. Is the resurrection so real that you're willing to say, I'm going to change my job because of it? Yeah, it's funny. I just thought about this. My brother-in-law, Dale Albertson, him and his wife are going to be a missionary in Spain by December, I think it is. And the point is, when he became a Christian at 40 years old, it was a miraculous conversion. Prior to that, he was a great used car salesman. You know what he told me? He had to stop selling used cars after he became a Christian. He couldn't sell them anymore. Because he couldn't say all the things that he used to say that all the used car dealers say. He couldn't make a living at it anymore because he had to be honest. And he left. He's glad he left. We have to be willing to look at every aspect of our lives, our work, our friends, etc. Now, one of the questions you might ask about this is, well, wait a second. So we have to separate from the people, separate from the work, etc. How are we going to evangelize people that we don't even know? Well, that's a good question. I'm not saying we leave the world. I'm not saying we don't have Christian friends, okay? The guideline that I would give you is, are you participating in their sin? I think that's a good guideline. Let me give you an example. Is it a sinful atmosphere? One of the things that I've done recently and I enjoy doing is going to the Bowie Coin Club. It's a coin collectors club. Meet once a month. Not that it's the main reason I go there, but when I'm there, I get a chance to share the gospel with people that haven't heard the gospel or are not believers. Become friends with some of them, okay? Nothing wrong with that because the coin club is not promoting immorality. If it were named the Bowie Strip Club, I would not be going there. Because it would be participating in their sin to be there. But the Bowie Coin Club, it's neither moral nor immoral, and it's fine. If you enjoy collecting coins, show up and have a good time. So I'm not saying we have to cut off all of our associations. We don't want to do that. We've got to be able to evangelize and teach people and show people about Christ. But what I am saying is, if they're dragging you down and pulling you into their circumstances and pulling you into sin, that's the time to step back and say, wait, I got to cut this off. I have to say the resurrection is so real in my life that I'm going to go away from something I like because the resurrection is so real I'm going to change. That's what Paul's trying to tell the Corinthians, and that's what we need to look at. Every aspect of our life. Does it show that we believe in the resurrection or not? And it doesn't mean you can't do it doesn't mean that 24/7 you've got to be preaching resurrection to people, okay? But it does mean you can't be living an unholy life. You can't be turning against God, and you've got to decide what's honoring to God, what's not. We can be in the world without being of the world, and that's what Christ was talking about. The second thing I want to talk about here in our application is our future. If you are a believer in Jesus Christ, you have the assurance of the resurrection. I've been mentioning this all along, but think about it. If that doesn't change you, there's something wrong and nothing's going to change you. I mean, think about it. You are assured that no matter what happens in this life, no matter how stinking this life becomes, no matter how terrible things become, Life is like this, and it's even smaller. And eternity, the everlasting life is like that, and even more. No matter how bad this gets, that's going to be wonderful. And that should change our attitude. That should make us different. It doesn't mean that we ignorantly smile at everything as we go through life or something. But what it does mean is it affects our life, it affects our action, it affects the relationship we have with God. And not only that, if we go back to verse 36 and look what it says, it affects whether we are ignorant of God or not. If you believe in the resurrection, as I believe in the resurrection, it is the responsibility for each one of us to know who God is and know about God and to learn more and more and more about God. I'm not saying you have to get a degree in theology. I'm not saying you have to know every theological word. But I don't care where you are or what position you are in life, every single one of us is capable of learning things about God. Every single one of us is capable at some level of studying the Bible. Is the resurrection real or is it not real? The Corinthians, it wasn't real to many of them, and Paul said, it is to your shame. If you don't spend time trying to find out who God is and learn about your relationship with God, that is to your shame. I say that to myself too, for any one of us. We can't get off the hook there. Does the resurrection change your thoughts? And does it change your actions? That's what Paul was talking about. Not that that we're nice people and we all sit around and smile at each other and we got great fellowship. No. Does it change you? Does it give you a passion to tell people about Christ? To teach people about Christ? To show people about Christ? The final thing I want to talk about on application is God's plan. We can see all of this. God set up the entire plan for the resurrection, for adoption. We can see that in Ephesians and many other places. It's all under His control. We can see that He created the different species, the different types of heavenly bodies, the spiritual body and the physical body. All of that is part of a plan. Well, not only is there a plan for different species, there is a plan for you in your life if you're a believer. God has a plan for what He wants you to do. I don't mean He has every step mapped out and you're walking along like a robot, okay? But God has something for you to do. I don't care if you're 10 years old or 90 years old. You're not done unless you've been planted. Then you got a right to wait around for the resurrection. If you're not dead, you should be doing. It's that simple. We have to know that God has a plan for us. We have to know the reality of the resurrection. We have to learn to know God through the Bible and through our relationship with God. And we have to allow that to change us to live a holy life. And the question I'm going to leave with you today is, are you going to allow God to act in your life based on the resurrection of Jesus Christ and based on your assured resurrection coming up? Or are you going to say, God, no, you're pretty good, but I got a couple areas that are mine. It doesn't work. But the choice is yours. You can hold back for God, or you can say, God, wow, you sent your Son, He died for us, and then you raised Him from the dead to prove you can do it for me. Is that going to change your life or not? Let's go ahead and pray.